Abortion bans don't ban abortion. They just endanger women.
Well, there you saw it. That's JB Pritzker, Governor JB Pritzker, telling us that you cannot ban abortions. All you can do, he says, is endanger. And that was the bill signing, because as everybody knows from our regular shows, everything that's going on in the last session is massive. Okay, and we're all sorts of massive legislation. This was massive expansion of abortion. And it was a real love-in. It was mostly women there. There were a few men. And, you know, he promised, Governor Pritzker promised women that he would make this essentially the most progressive state in the country with respect, as he calls it, with respect to abortion. And that's what he did. Because basically the Reproductive Health Care or Health Care Act that they passed basically gives a woman a fundamental right to abortion for the complete 9 months of her term.
Yeah, Jeff, they don't call it, they're not using the word abortion as much as they're using the term the Reproductive Health Act, which the governor signed into law up in Chicago. And, you know, when we say it's a massive expansion, that's kind of on the whole fulcrum of the argument. On one side, you have the governor and Representative Kelly Cassidy, who is the House sponsor of the bill, saying that this is really just codifying practices that were already in place, and they're bringing it together to make the law clear. And the other side is saying, no, this is a vast expansion of abortion, and you hear that from the House Republicans.
Well, right, and I think the main issues to get at, if there's a change, is the issue of partial birth abortion. And I would say that it's been a little vague. There was a law against partial birth abortion in Illinois. There's a federal law against partial birth abortion. But the way in which those laws are enforced or not, the way in which doctors decide whether to give abortions, a little bit vague under Roe v. Wade and the progeny. So, but it's clear, I think it's clear, that prior to this passing of this legislation, women in Illinois have an unlimited right to go to a doctor and have an abortion any time. There would be this sort of maybe facade of the life or the health of the mother being at issue, the doctor deciding that. And I think the concern was the closer they got to 9 months, the more problematic it might be if challenged.
Well, let's listen to what the governor has to say as he was at the bill signing. As we tape this, it was yesterday.
Those opposed to women's reproductive rights are emboldened, and they're not just looking to curtail those rights. They are looking to eliminate them altogether, and their hopeful eyes are on the highest court in the land. In the last few weeks, we've seen state legislatures in Georgia, Alabama, Ohio, Louisiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, and Indiana pass near complete bans on access to abortion. Right now, in Missouri, the last remaining clinic providing reproductive care is fighting a legal battle to keep the state from shutting it down. And as a result, more and more Missouri women are being forced to travel to Illinois and to Kansas to exercise their rights and access care. Make no mistake about it, and listen up. Abortion bans don't ban abortion. They just endanger women.
And now I look forward to working with the governor and our pro-choice leaders in the Senate and the House to pass the next important bill, and that's to repeal the dangerous parental notice of abortion law.
Well, that was a big signal, because you heard in the speaker, Melissa Wyden, right at the end, she referred to the Dean's parental law. And to be clear, as you talk to folks, they speak of Dean's involvement of parents in the abortion decision of a minor. That is a very unusual way to describe the parental notice law That is dangerous, Terry. If you're the father or the mother of a daughter who's having an abortion or thinking of and has gone to a doctor for such, these folks would say it's dangerous to say to the provider he or she has to notify the parents.
Well, this was,
that's unusual description, isn't it?
some of the Republicans or voters out there might think that the Republicans just got rolled, the Republicans in the legislature, but this was the parental notification was something that the Democrats wanted to get rid of and yet stayed in there, and so that's why Melissa Wyden was referring to working on that next. And again, as we said earlier, the governor correctly notes that other states are tightening abortion law, and so now with Illinois expanding the availability of abortion, it is making Illinois, in many ways, the odd man out, but also, as he would say, maybe one of the more, or the most perhaps, progressive as far as allowing the availability of abortion. And again, this is the cusp of the argument. The people like Kelly Cassidy, Representative Kelly Cassidy, would say it's women's reproductive health, and that's why they called it the Reproductive Health Act. But other representatives, including Representative Avery Bourne, a Republican, who led the debate for the Republicans in the House, said, you're not just codifying what's out there, you're really expanding it. And interesting to note that as she delivered these remarks about 10 days ago or so, she was very close to giving birth herself. Here's the remarks against the bill of Representative Avery Bourne.
We heard something earlier that said there is no woman who chooses an abortion with a healthy baby late term. The Guttmacher Institute, which some of you may know, which is the preeminent pro-choice research institute, actually says that's not the case. In a survey of 272 women who had late-term abortions, they acknowledge, it says, data suggests that most women seeking later terminations are not doing so for the reasons of fetal anomaly or life endangerment. So what are we doing with this bill? Voting on this bill is allowing third trimester post-viability abortions to happen outside of the strict life and health of the mother, and we are opening up viability to mean that some babies would not be determined to be viable until they took a breath. This is not about keeping abortion legal in Illinois. This is about a vast expansion of what is allowed.
So this really sets up the debate for 2020. A lot of people said this issue is over, pro-choice prevails and so forth. Well, they got this expansive legislation in. It's becoming a national issue. They have, the pro-choice folks said this doesn't affect parental notice, even though they said that that's the next step to eliminate it. They say this doesn't affect the right of conscience. That is, they say persons who are involved in abortions or could be and don't choose to be, they don't have to be. So they probably want to change that as well. And partial birth, though, it's a little vague. They're kind of saying there's been no change here, and yet I think you and I would say probably there is an impact, or at least I would say, can't speak for you, Terry, probably this law, as it will be enforced by the courts, will be more expansive than is currently the case with respect to partial birth abortion. But unless you have some dad, Terry, we're back in that mode where we're running out of time and we got to go on to the next topic. Do you want to close it up?
No, I would just say that this is an expansion, and like we see at the national level, this may go to the courts. Obviously, it sets up, when we look at the federal government with what President Trump has already did, putting two conservatives on the court. This is exactly what the people like Governor Pritzker and his followers are concerned about, as the governor talked about. And that the idea is that President Trump will likely get a third appointee to the Supreme Court, and maybe more if he is reelected in 2020. So we see this issue. We have to look at it in the context of what's also happening at the federal level. That's how the governor and his supporters are looking at it, and that's what's pushing this push them to have this passed now.
Okay, so let's go on the other topic, which we'll just discuss briefly, because we've discussed pretty much before, but we have a quick thing to add. I said massive expansion of abortion. Segment 2 is massive $45 billion capital fund. And massive, it was massive to begin with at $41.5 billion when you and I last discussed this prior to the passing of the bill. And it hasn't been signed yet. That'll be coming up soon. But somehow in the last week of session, the proposed legislation went from $41.5 billion to $45 billion. That's not the kind of growth we want. And the financing went from $18 billion in bonds to $21 billion. So that's news. The pay-as-you-go $14 billion taxes, $2 billion a year, that seems to stay roughly the same. I don't know that we have a list of projects that give us the details.
I don't have a whole list of projects, but there is where different members are going to be getting something like $3 million each to be handing out in their districts. People said, look, while there's bipartisan support for the capital bill, you're not going to pass $45 billion in a capital bill and not get what some people are going to say is pork. There's something like $1 million for an HIV garden in Chicago. Maybe that's a good idea. Someone supported it, but that's the kind of thing that sometimes people say, really, we should be spending $1 million to celebrate or to, have a garden on HIV losses.
Yes.
You can go through and certainly find any number of things that are not the traditional roads and bridges to be repaired as was sold to people.
Right. There was lots of pork in this, undeniably so. $50 million may not sound like a lot relative to $4.5 billion, but $50 million goes to the Illinois Arts Council, chaired by Shirley
$45
Madigan.
billion, right?
Yeah.
Not 4.5 billion, yeah. $45 billion.
Okay.
Yeah, so in that context, 50 million might seem like small potatoes, but go ahead.
Relative to 45 billion. Sorry, thanks for the correction. But 50 million is something, and that goes to the Illinois Arts Council, chaired by Shirley Madigan, who, of course, is the wife of Speaker Mike Madigan. Really, that stuff shouldn't happen, and it wouldn't happen if we didn't do this craziness where we push legislation through in the last minute, essentially the last minute or last day, and people don't look at it, they don't have a time to debate it, they don't have a time to discuss it, and all sorts of waste and pork go on. And that's something that can't continue.
And that works to the benefit of the different members, because they can get their little pet project stuck in the bill, and people don't have time to go through and debate it on the floor and take it out, because then everyone's pressed to get out on time.
Right. And I'll just say there is some interplay here between the operating budget and the capital fund budget. And there were 8 state reps who stood up, signed an article, appeared in Chicago Sun-Times and perhaps others, that said we shouldn't be doing it this way. One reason they said why you have a $45 billion capital fund budget is you don't do this annually. You do it every 9 or 10 years.
Right.
And you should look at it. And we can't go on about that, but we should note, maybe we should note the people who signed this, because there were 8 Republican state reps who said they were dissatisfied with the way the operating budget negotiations were handled, and the capital fund was handled. And they referred to things like the state is saddled with debt from unpaid bills, there's excessive mandates for spending, job-killing regulations, crushing pension and Medicaid burdens, record-setting numbers of government taxing bodies. He said they have to deal with, the legislature needs to deal with these issues, and then they can get on to funding priorities.
Yeah, the thing I would say I want the people to say, when we talk, there's the operating budget, the capital budget, there's the whole question of do we have a balanced budget? Earlier this week, as we tape this, the City Club, our friends at the City Club of Chicago, who put on some excellent programs, had a panel on Governor Pritzker's first 100 days. One of the panelists was NPR reporter who covers the State House, Daisy Contreras. let's listen to what she was saying as she explained how these issues were all tied together for the lawmakers to have to weigh.
And so this infrastructure bill has funding for vertical and horizontal construction projects, vertical for maintenance of state-owned buildings like prisons and universities, and horizontal money for maintaining roads, bridges, and transportation projects, mass transportation projects, among other things. Most notable in the plan is how is the state going to pay for all of this? There is an increase in the gas tax, which the last capital bill did not include. It has now been doubled to 38 cents, and it is set to increase with inflation over time in order to keep up with the rising costs of construction and to maintain the roads. The diesel fuel tax is another example that also increased 5 cents and also tied with inflation. And one very interesting thing for me as a journalist watching this, tied to this capital plan, is the expansion of gambling across the state. The licensing fees from the 6 new casinos and from legalizing sports betting and the increase in video gaming taxes will go toward funding the vertical projects, maintaining buildings. The gaming expansion bill was pretty much the revenue component to this part of the capital plan. And so if lawmakers, for example, wanted money for their university buildings in their towns, they would have to accept this gaming expansion bill. And if you wanted a casino in your city, or if you were all for legalizing sports betting, then you needed to take a vote in favor of raising the vehicle registration tax and raising the tax on tobacco. So everything was tied together.
Okay, so that was the establishment view. It's all tied together, you know, the gaming, the capital fund, the operating budget, and we almost can't even think about it. The other view from the 8 Republican state reps who dissented, just a bit to identify, 8 Republican state reps of the 44 Republican House caucus, Lane, Wilhauer, Republican, Effingham, all Republicans, so I won't say that, Bratt, Albrecht, Shelbyville, McSweeney, Barrington Hills, Darren Bailey, Xenia.
And remind, what are these members you're naming?
These people are all 8 Republican state reps who said they dissented from the way things were handled in this capital budget and the way their party, the Republican Party, their leader, Jim Durkin, negotiated the capital budget, the operating budget, and so forth. They didn't think they stood up for their principles, which I said, you got to do this more carefully, more thoughtfully. It's rounded out. The other 4 were Chris Miller from Oakland.
Okay, let's move along here, Jeff. You know, the problem is that the governor is saying that they passed a balanced budget, that they made the requirement of the full required payment to the pension system. Just the other day, I interviewed Sheila Weinberg. Sheila is the president and CEO of the Truth in Accounting, and she started this about 30 years ago because she would notice basically how government at the federal level and at the state level were always wrong about what they were saying, and that they are claiming budgets are balanced when they're not. And she, particularly in this interview, she made the note that when we are talking about making the payment to the pension system, and therefore that means that we passed a balanced budget with the rest of it, that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, back around 2013, accused the state of fraud because the ramp is nowhere near enough of the payment to meet the obligations. Here's what Sheila Weinberg had to say.
The problem is that the SEC determined that this plan, in essence, it's a pension scheme to fund the pensions over the next 50 years, is so out of balance and so out of whack that when the state included the comment that, hey, this funds our pensions over the next 50 years, the SEC charged the state with securities fraud.
So there you heard it from Sheila Weinberg. She's really an expert on this. She's devoted most of her adult life to focusing on pensions, to essentially focusing on what she might call government pension fraud. If the corporations did this, the SEC would be all over private corporations. But I guess because it's a city government or a state government, they can get away with it.
Well, and this is the
So-
thing that Sheila says, and I want to play just one more bite from this, about a 40-minute interview people can see on the Illinois Channel website. But Sheila said, you know, when we are being told that these budgets are balanced, tain't necessarily so.
But because these politicians use this balanced budget rhetoric, which is false, citizens don't have the information that they need to be knowledgeable participants in their government. They don't have the information they need to know whether we do need a progressive income tax or not. Who knows? We don't have a latest financial report. They're telling us the budget's balanced. And instead of highlighting that we really are $216 billion in the hole.
So you can find out more about this by going to her organization's website, truthinaccounting.org. It's all laid out there. Illinois, she compares Illinois with all the other states. Each state is analyzed. Illinois is in terrible shape. $200 billion underfunded pensions for the state of Illinois. City of Chicago is in terrible shape, relative to other cities. $70 billion. You can go to the statedatalab.org, which is shown on the screen there. The short of it is this. Here's the debate. And Governor Pritzker and I did a little bit of this debate. Hopefully we'll have him on the show and we'll do more. But he says, look, we're following the statute. We're following the Edgar ramp, which was 1995, almost a quarter century ago. We're pitting what the statute requires, and that's good enough. And Sheila Weinberg says, no. I said to him, no, basically quoting Sheila, that's not good enough. One thing, if you were to do the way people look at as more a conservative, more thoughtful plan, you wouldn't have this ramp. You would have equal payments, relatively equal across the last 25 years and going forward. So you wouldn't back end the stuff. All the big payments come $19 billion right at the end, because maybe you don't have it. So that is the debate. Should it be like your mortgage, these equal payments, or should it be ramped up and very little at the beginning, a lot at the end? And she says it's basic. So
I asked her, Jeff, how much would the payment need to be for us to be actually balancing the budget? And she said it would have to be $13 billion payment now, not $8 billion.
Right, this is by putting, and actually the governor corrected me, it's not, he says, might be right, they put in not 8.4 billion, but they put in 9 billion. But I say that's still just barely covering the interest. If you put in what Sheila said, 13 billion, you're starting to pay back the principal or portion that's unfunded. So if you do that a little bit each year, a little bit being 4 or 5 billion, then by the time you get to 2045, you're okay. You're not have to say, oh my gosh, we're way underfunded.
Let me just make a quick.
We probably have to go on. Yeah.
Well, we do, but let me make one quick statement, and I don't want to sound like we're just beating up the governor and his supporters.
Sure.
One of the things they also did is they put $1.3 billion toward paying down the unpaid budget backlog, or the bill backlog. And that's commendable. And the other thing is they passed a budget, which obviously didn't happen very often under the Rauner years. So by virtue of the fact that they did pass a budget, they're trying to put more money in, they paid at least the pension payment that was called for, but as Sheila says, that's not enough. And we ought to be, as she would say, truth in accounting. We got to be not just going by the rhetoric that we're told as voters that these budgets are balanced.
So, excuse me, a quick close to that is the Edgar ramp was in trouble from the beginning. People would say, people are, it's like wire points. They would point out that the benefits assumptions of Jim Edgar were way too low. He and others increased dramatically when they negotiated with the state employees, the pension benefits, and the mortality rate has gone way down. So people are living longer. So for those reasons, aside from what we said before about should be more equal, not a ramp, when the benefits in your assumptions change, you're going to have to adjust, and maybe you should not expand pension benefits as much as you have with that. Let's go on to gaming, because we've talked about it before, but now it's legislation. Well, it hasn't been signed yet, but it will be. It's passed the House, passed the Senate, and again, the word that comes to mind: massive gaming expansion throughout the state of Illinois. 6 new casinos. Racetracks become racinos because they have stations, gaming stations at them. Airports become casinos because they have gaming stations at them. My calculation, roughly 10,000 stations now, going to something like 40,000.
You know, for
Okay.
years, Illinois used to have more people in horse racing than Kentucky. That surprises people. But the horse industry has been decimated in Illinois because the purse here isn't worth bringing the horses in and the expense. I've been told this by the racetrack people. And so when you call these racetracks racinos, maybe that's a fair description, but they're saying they need those gambling units at the racetracks to make them viable as an industry. And we tend not to think about how much money goes through these and how much employment there was and how much we've lost. So in a way, this could also be called pro-business because, but you know, by those in these establishments, it's one area where the governor and the legislature has tried to goose at least a segment of the economy. We'll have to see.
Yeah, the short response to that is when you have a massive expansion in spending, which is this is for gaming, this is going to require a massive increase in taxes, pay as you go, massive bonds, 21 billion, have to be paid back along with interest. When you do that payback, those expanded taxes, you're going to be crowding out other growth. Illinois is a very low growth state in terms of its private sector relative to the other
You know,
states.
one of the things though too, Jeff, let's talk about the economy at large. And the state got $1.5 billion in April. They weren't expecting because the national economy growing at about 3.2%. We hope that keeps up, but the question now is we're doing all kinds of fight with the Chinese, a little bit with Mexico, the president's imposing tariffs. And recently, James Bullard, the president of the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, spoke at the Union League Club of Chicago, and we'll talk about monetary policy, that is setting interest rates, and whether or not they're going to hold steady or just how they're going to be going.
Trade regime could be a negative factor that could come back to haunt U.S. macroeconomic performance. So I think that's the spirit in which you should take what I'm saying. If we're going to have uncertainty about the global trade regime for a long time, then that's a negative factor for global growth, and that probably feeds back to the U.S.
So I think what he's saying there is that looking at tariffs and look, you had really high growth and people were very happy about that in 2018. 3%. First quarter this year, 3.2%. Under Obama and last year or two and the years throughout, more like 1.5% to 2%. When you have a 1% increase in growth in GDP in this country, you know, you're talking about roughly $700 billion more that's pumped out in GDP. That's a lot of dough. So the point is, the Fed is saying with these tariffs, they could foresee a slowing down of the economy. They may have to adjust to their targets or adjust their targets which, in terms of inflation, which means basically lowering interest rates, federal funds rate, other rates, as we go past the summer into the fall. And they would hope that would correct that and keep the economy growing at a nice high rate with price stability. How does that affect Illinois? I'm not sure we can count on having another $1.5 billion dropped into the Illinois.
We'll have to see. If the president can get a deal with China, that might really goose the budget or the growth again. We'll have to see. The other thing I would say is the governor's still going to be signing some more bills. So when we come back next week, we'll perhaps have more bill signing, more comments to cover, Jeff.
We got to get out.
We got to get out.
So everybody share this program. Be sure to come back next week and go to and watch all of these programs that are on youtube.com/Illinois Channel TV.
Thanks for joining us.